Russia Bank, where they are saying $1 is like 130 NPR. So this is the nominal exchange rate. So if you account, or if you adjust for the price factors, relative prices, then we have something called as a real exchange rate. So what this figure shows is nominal effective exchange rate, which is weighted average of all those bilateral nominal exchange rate, being used is the overall trade. So you can see that the real effective exchange rate increased over the last 2 decades by almost 40%, whereas the nominal effective exchange rate decreased. So what this means is that appreciation of a real exchange rate is coming from the higher domestic prices relative to the price of its trading partners. Now, we did some empirical analysis to see the magnitude of the impact of this appreciation of bilateral real exchange rate on the lower exports. So what we find is that if there is a 10% increase or appreciation in a bilateral real exchange rate, then that will lead to a 3% decrease in the Nepal exports. And for this purpose, we use the national micro customs data from Ministry of Finance for period 2010 to 2014 and 2018 to 2021. Now, if you look, and this impact, the magnitude of this impact varies depending on the size of the firms. For example, if the firm size is larger relative to the median firms, what we can see is that the magnitude is 3.4%, which means that if there is a 10% increase in a real exchange rate, that will lead to the 3.4% decrease in Nepali exports. Now, also, if you look at the firms that exports to many destinations, the impact is lower. And if the firm sells many products, then the impact is lower. The reason being that they will be able to diversify based on the value of bilateral real exchange rate. So with that findings, we have a key recommendation here. So our recommendation to improve export performance and also the external competitiveness is to increase the domestic productivity and contain the domestic inflation. So in terms of increasing the domestic productivity, we have there are many ways. So, but in the current issue of Nepal Development Update, we highlighted 3 or 4 ways where that can lead to the domestic productivity. One is to changing the current tax regime structure from more trade-based to domestic production-based or non-trade-based. And second is to reduce the high import tariff. And the final recommendation to improve the productivity is to simplify and streamline the process of FTI, which not only brings the foreign money, foreign exchange, but also brings knowledge and also the spillover effects. So this is in terms of increasing the domestic productivity and in terms of containing the domestic inflation. So if you remember, we thought earlier that this higher real exchange rate has to do with the higher prices of goods and services in Nepal related to trading partners. So once we contain the domestic inflation, then we'll be able to also reduce the gap between this inflation difference between the Nepal and the trading partners, and ultimately that will prevent the further real appreciation of the exchange rates. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take the questions during the Q&A, which is after the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nayanji, for presenting the findings and outlining the key priorities identified in the report. Now it is time to formally unveil the South Asia Development Update and Nepal Development Update October 2023. I'd like to kindly request Vice Chancellor of Kathmandu University, Professor Dr. Bhola Thapa, World Bank Country Director for Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, Mr. Faris Sadat Service, World Bank Chief Economist for South Asia, Ms. Francisca, Operations Manager for Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, Ms. Lara Strekova, Country Economist, Mr. Nayan Krishna Joshi, and President of Society Economic Journalists, Mr. Susan Oli, to kindly come up to the stage and unveil the report. I'd like to request everyone to pause for a few moments while we take a photograph and kindly hold the report up. Thank you. You can download the reports from the World Bank website, and a QR code is also available in the venue and on your tables for easy download. Thank you, everyone. Now, as we move forward towards the panel discussion on productivity, exchange rates, and exports, I would like to call upon panel chair for the session, Honorable Member of National Planning Commission, Dr. Ramesh Chandra Paudel, to chair the panel, and Dr. Rajan Krishna Panta, Director, Nepal Rashtra Bank, to moderate the session and also introduce our esteemed panelists and panel chair. Thank you.
Honorable Member of the Planning Commission, National Planning Commission, Dr. Ramesh Chandra Paudel, World Bank Chief Economist for South Asia, Franziska Onsorke, and World Bank Country Director for Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, Dr. Faris Haddad, members from diplomatic communities, and I've seen a lot of familiar faces, friends from media, and ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and namaste everyone. So I'm Rajan Panta. I'm Director of Nepal Rashtra Bank, the Central Bank of Nepal. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel and related to the export competitiveness. And this is one of the part of the Nepal development update that is recently released. And my goal today is, I just have about 30 minutes today to shed light on that specific part of that NDU report on the export competitiveness, and hopefully add some more nuances to that report, and that will be forming the part of the comprehensive economic memorandum. As we all know, this export is a very vast and comprehensive topic, so we may not be able to cover all these issues, but as this issue focuses mainly on two issues, macro issues, that is on productivity and on real exchange rate, and we'll be discussing on those two issues and also its impact on exports. So I have a very amazing panelist today to discuss this issue. My first panelist is Dr. Paris Kharel, who is an Executive Director of South Asia Economics Watch on Trade, Economics and Environment, a Kathmandu-based think tank, who has a specialization in international trade and microeconometrics. He has several publications, including 2 edited volumes on South Asian cooperation integration and articles in peer-reviewed journals. Please help me welcome Dr. Paris Kharel. Next down, I have Ms. Arati Rajalakshmi Rana, who is the Chief Business Officer at Lakshmi Sunrise Bank Limited. She is a seasoned professional banker with more than 2 decades of experience at various banks. She is also the Director of Private Equity and Venture Capital firm Atenta Fund Management Limited. Please help me welcome Ms. Arati. And finally, we have Dorothy Locha, who is the Program Manager for Employment and Income and First Secretary for International Cooperation at Embassy of Switzerland. Ms. Locha is a specialist in the area of sustainable development of markets and innovation system. She has experience working in various countries of Africa, the Caribbean, and South Asia. So please help me welcome all the panelists. Yes, thank you. Let me start with a broad picture. So as we have just seen that during last 2 decades or so, imports have gone up as a percentage of GDP, but exports have practically stagnated. And as a result, we have a huge trade deficit, almost like 20% of GDP, and this is also increasing. On the other hand, we have seen that the the growth rate is almost like 4% or 4.3% in last 2 decades or so, compared to about 6% growth in other South Asian regions like India, Bangladesh, or Bhutan. So in this context, I would like to start with Dr. Pares. So how do you characterize the export performance in Nepal, and how, the follow-up question is, how would you situate the report in the context of trade and development challenges facing Nepal? Yes.
Thank you, Rajanji. Barely a day goes by in the media without a reference to Nepal's soaring trade deficit. So I at times argue that trade deficit has become a national obsession, this topic, given the coverage it gets in the media. And in 2019, the government of Nepal came up with what it calls the National Trade Deficit Reduction Strategy itself, which includes some export promotion measures as well as some import restricting or import substituting measures. And then the government also imposed a set of import restrictions in 2022, and it was partly, as per it, in response to rising imports. The government has also recently come up with Nepal Trade Integration Strategy 2023, which identifies export potential products and sectors, and then also details action matrices to increase exports. And improving competitiveness, and this is related to the current discussion, is at the heart of Nepal Trade Integration Strategy 2023. And as we saw from the World Bank's analysis, exports, in terms of exports, Nepal ranks at the bottom of the ladder, whether it's per capita exports or exports as a share of GDP. And then services exports have overtaken goods exports for at least 5 or 7 years. But then the increase in services exports have not been able to make up for the decline in goods exports. That's the main problem. And Nepal's export market is highly concentrated. Basically, 2/3 go to the Indian market. Product diversification is low, yeah. But then it's still high compared to, say, Bangladesh. You see, so product diversification is high compared to Bangladesh, but that's of small consolation because the volume, the scale is very low. And then there's limited or low sophistication in our export basket, right? But then to link it to the productivity discussions that's taking place here, sophistication is an issue, but then how we export also really matters. For example, we have iron and steel in our export basket. Iron and steel, that would constitute a highly or a relatively complex or sophisticated export compared to tea, for example. But then the value addition in the case of tea, which is an agriculture product, and its employment generation potential is very high. And then Nepal is graduating from the least developed country status in 2026, right? We will lose a set of preferences that we get in advanced economy markets. And projections have it that our exports will be hit by 2.5 to 4%, but that's based on modeling estimates. And that's relatively low compared to the export shock to Bangladesh. Let's say about 10% hit to exports of Bangladesh compared to just 2.5 or 4% hit to Nepal's export basket. But this is because we have not been able to fully utilize the preferences that we have received. And inadequate or low productivity or declining productivity could be a contributor to this aspect. And improving competitiveness and productivity will feature prominently, or has to feature prominently, in the way we chart out our future in the post-graduation context. So this is the basic situation in which I see this report. And one final point is that, as we saw in the World Bank's analysis, our debt to GDP ratio is really soaring over the past 5 or 6 years, nearly double in terms of GDP as a share of GDP. And the World Bank and the IMF, in their joint analysis of Nepal's debt situation, have found Nepal to be of relatively low debt distress. And that is a judgment call, and that hinges, as they explicitly say, on the fact that we receive a lot of remittances, right? But given our weak export performance, and thereby our foreign exchange earnings from exports, they have cautioned in their analysis, in the past, that this low level of debt distress is thanks to the remittances, in fact. And this calls for caution given our low export performance. So our low export performance, which is partly a function of our low productivity, has implications for our debt distress going forward also. I'll pause here. Thank you.
Thank you, Paras. Next, I would like to move on to Ms. Arati. So we have just heard about the, the growing trade deficit and perhaps the unsustainable trade deficit, and which is mainly financed by inward remittances. So in this context, which sectors do you think should Nepal prioritize for export promotion or import substitutions? And a follow-up question, since you are a seasoned banker, is that since the central bank has mandated like different credit programs for different sectors of the economy for export promotion, like for agriculture, energy, cottage, and micro and SMI, what is your take on the effect or the assessment of these mandated credit programs on these sectors, and also some thoughts about green financing initiatives? Thank you.
Thank you, Rajan sir, for the question. And thank you, World Bank team, for giving me this opportunity to express my thoughts and perspectives. Well, we've gone through the presentation, wonderful, NDU, SDU, and a lot of information regarding the country's inability to improve export. Import has not increased in the last year, but if you look at import and export volume, I think import holds a major portion in terms of trade. The remittances are increasing, which is a good sign, yes. But if you look at the real sector, I think there is a reduced demand of product and services, which is impacting the overall business in the economy. That's what I feel from the banker's perspective, because of the fact that over the last 3-4 years, I've seen in the industry, the NPAs, there's an uptick on the NPA, so which also kind of shows that the performances of the business sectors is actually not doing too good. But having said that, I see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And of course, by that I mean electricity. There are very good news making rounds over the last few weeks of, like if you look at last year's electricity trade, I mean, Nepal did export around, let's say, to 10 billion of electricity to India, but if you look at the import volume, it's even more. I mean, it's almost 19.01 billion Nepal imported electricity from India. So there's still a deficit of, like around 8 billion in terms of electricity, in terms of trade deficit. So I think this trade deficit in terms of electricity over the past 5 years has reduced by threefold, which is a good sign. And if all the projects that are in operation, they come to commercial operation, I mean, all those projects which are under construction come into operation, by 2026, we are hoping that the country becomes self-reliant in terms of electricity. The recent news of Indian cabinet approving import of 10,000 megawatt of electricity from India in the next 10 years is a very good news, and I think this is going to be a game changer for the country's economic development, and it is going to be a good transformation, economic transformation for the country, as such news is going to bring in more investment in the particular sector in Nepal. So that's what we are expecting. And looking at the energy, we are already exporting. India has approved importing 452 megawatt of electricity from Nepal, and recently they've added 180 megawatt additional. So this is a positive news towards a better economic growth of the country in the future. So that's what I see. And coming back to the banking sector now, what has central bank done in terms of directing the commercial bank lending into the energy sector. By 2083, that is next 3 years, all commercial banks need to maintain at least 10% of their exposure on the energy sector. So if you look at the current figure, in 2023, I was just going through the numbers. The exposure of commercial banks in the energy sector is around 303 billion, which in 2020 was around 152 billion, almost 100% of growth into the energy sector. So I think the central bank direction towards directing the commercial bank to lend into the hydropower sector is also to a great extent helping this hydro sector development. I mean, so it's a good thing for the country's economy, and the commercial banks of the country, including Lakshmi Sunrise, where I represent, we are very much committed to the development of hydropower projects in Nepal.
Let me jump into the issue of this productivity. As Professor Paul Krugman famously quipped, you know, productivity is not everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. And so the report highlights the labor productivity as a key factor for weak external competitiveness in Nepal. So let me turn on to Dorothy. So do you agree with this evidence, the evidence they provided? And what can a development partner like SDC, the Swiss Development Corporation, and other development partners do in order to ameliorate this situation?
Thank you very much, and also thank you for being part of this panel. Yeah, in my position at the Swiss Development Corporation, I'm meeting regularly companies, associations, professional federations, and it is pretty evident from our exchanges that they're looking for very skilled staff, right, in order to be able to be productive and perform as they could and use really their potentials. So access to skilled labor, I think, is a real issue in this country, and this is also hampering the productivity of the companies, but also at the macroeconomic level. And in the same time, the Nepali youth is looking for work. I just found a figure that 35% in 2017, and the figures didn't change a lot, 35% of the Nepali youth were neither in education or training nor in employment. The figure is double for women, 47% than for men, which is 22%, but even 22% is very high. And this is really an issue also for the market, because there is a huge potential, there is a demographic dividend, if you want to, that is not yet used, and that should be used in order to really have this country perform economically. So the Swiss Development Corporation has a focus on this issue and also on productivity in general, but technical education and training is really one of our pillars in our employment and income domain, because we have seen this issue of lack of skilled labor in the market here in Nepal. People are looking for staff from abroad, from India or other countries, and the youth needs income and jobs, right? So we have a full portfolio for technical and vocational education and training. Just to give you a few examples, we're working very closely with the government and also with the private sector, with associations and federations, to establish a national vocational qualification framework here that defines the competencies that are required by the market to perform and to be productive. This framework has been endorsed last year, and the private sector has really played an important role also in the definition of the competencies, because if we have competencies that are not required by the market, that are not future-oriented, the whole training and education system is not fulfilling its task, right? Based on the qualification framework, the government, with our support and the support of the private sector, defines standards, defines curricula, so as the whole technical education system is really oriented towards the market needs. And also we are supporting the provincial governments and governments at all levels to increase the quality of technical education. And we're working with school, therefore, to increase the quality, also the quality of training of instructors in order to have really a performing training system. And finally, we are supporting also the government and the industries to establish new models for dual education, dual apprenticeship. That's a model where the youth spends 1 day per week in at school and 5 days per week in the industry, because we think and we believe, and there is also evidence that shows it, that people learn how to be productive, how to perform, and how to contribute really to the market while they're on the job at the industries. And this has been shown to be economically attractive both for the governments, for the private sector companies, and for the youth. So it's a win-win-win situation, as we see. And it's a very important basis factor for the productivity. For sure, I mean, I will not go much more into detail, but it's important that these youth are also absorbed by the market. It's not enough to train people. The market needs also be capable to use and employ those people with a decent salaries and decent conditions. And therefore, they need to be innovative. So we support also companies in innovation, agribusiness innovation, for example. In the Koshi province, we have a new program on digital innovation. And in order to innovate, there is a real need for enabling environments. There is a need for access to finance for small and medium companies, especially also. And there is also a need to have migrants reintegrated in the economy here. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so again, continuing on the theme of productivity, a recent World Bank report finds that the service sector has the potential to be the leading sector for economic development. And so we have seen that in Nepal, there is this, remarkable structural transformation in the last 2 or 3 decades. The share of the agriculture has declined from almost about 40% to now 25%, whereas the share of service sector has increased to almost 60% of GDP, and the manufacturing sector has actually declined, and the industrial sector has almost practically stagnated. So in this context, so Nepal, what do you think about the possibility of service-led development in Nepal? And despite this massive structural transformation, we have not been able to create meaningful jobs. And there is also concern about what we call this premature deindustrialization by Professor Danny Roderick. So what is your take on about the possibility or the prospects and challenges of services-led development in Nepal, as some of the reports have shown, like huge prospects in IT sector, and the exports, almost like half of the total merchandise exports. Yes.
So, as you rightly noted, Nepal has witnessed, its economy has witnessed a structural transformation or change of a remarkable or peculiar kind. Agriculture's share has gone down, services have increased, and manufacturing share has gone down. And if you look at, that's the share in GDP, but if you look at the share in employment, the share in employment of manufacturing has hardly budged. And Nepal has witnessed premature deindustrialization. I have written elsewhere that it's premature deindustrialization because its manufacturing as a share of GDP peaked around, say, 1999-2000. And at that level, if you look at our per capita income, say in 1990 constant dollars, and compare it with the cutoff estimated by Danny Roderick, or even before that by UNCTAD, it was way below that cutoff, you see. So our industrialization, at least one can say, is deindustrialization is much different than what we observe, say, in advanced economies. Okay, that's one point. And mirroring the fall in the share of manufacturing and agriculture in the GDP has been a fall in goods exports as a share of GDP without services taking up the slack. That's why we saw overall exports to GDP have gone down. And is there any issue with it, manufacturing going down, services increasing? Well, to be clear, I don't have a so-called manufacturing fetish, as there was a debate between Jagdish Bhagwati on the one hand side and Ha Jung Chang on the other. It was played out in The Economist magazine over a decade ago. The point is, what kind of services? Most of the services in Nepal that have grown are of the non-tradable variety. And they have on average well above average productivity, but they have not been able to absorb all these relatively high productivity services sector have not been able to absorb the labor that we have. And then we should also note that foreign exchange matters, right? We cannot replace all our imports. No one would suggest that. And then we need foreign exchange wherewithal, right? And it should come from somewhere, from either goods or services. But so far, services have not been able to take up that, responsibility. And globally, the evidence is that manufacturing is a tried and tested engine of long-term sustained growth within, sector growth that is labor intensive and absorbs labor in huge quantities. And even while doing so, witnesses within sector productivity growth. There is some evidence on services also to some extent, but not in a manner as tried and tested as in the case of manufacturing. That's why policymakers are hesitant to ditch, manufacturing, altogether. And then there's the question of IT services also, right? IT services are booming, and the data on IT experts that we see in the balance of payments are less than the actual figure. A study has also pointed that out, because some of them are earned, informally. But then, from the employment perspective, let's say 500,000 people enter the labor force each year, right? And almost the same number go to foreign shores to work. And which destinations are there? West Asia and Malaysia. Will the IT sector, for example, be able to provide employment to these people or not? So IT people will be able to provide employment to certain people, which is fine. But what about these people who go there to work? And it should be our intention to provide employment to them also. And some people frequently give the example of India's, IT sector. And Ashoka Modi, who was a former world banker and has come up with, I think, a fascinating book. I have written a book review on it also, India is Broken. And there he points out that for every, IT graduate who, is shining in, say, New Delhi or Bangalore, there are dozens of other people waiting in long queues for government jobs, whose qualification requirements are way below their own qualification in terms of certificate. So that aspect is there. So my point is that industry, services, agriculture, all are needed. And then arguments by some economists, even within Nepal, that now we should go for industry without smokestacks, presumably, referring to services, is not helpful. Yes, we can go for industry without smokestacks, manufacturing without smokestacks, provided we leverage our hydropower electricity, right? And then without burning fossil fuel, if we grow our manufacturing sector, that's fine. Thank you.
So again, moving on to this issue of this productivity. So we have seen that even though the agriculture's, the share of GDP is declining, majority of people are still employed in agriculture. So my question to Ms. Arati is, so what do you think are the steps to be taken to improve the agro sector productivity in Nepal? And we still have huge imports of agro products, and to boost agro products in Nepal.
I'm not an agro expert, but as banks, all commercial banks are again directed to lend at least 15% of their exposure in agriculture by 2083, that is in the next 3 years. And it's a very challenging task for all of us, because we are actually soliciting businesses and business houses, corporate houses, to invest in agriculture sector, but looks like it's very difficult to find business houses and corporate houses actually interested in this sector. Of course, there are some, but not many. But still, I would like to add something on agriculture as to there needs to be a shift from traditional farming to modern farming. Very important. So a lot of investment is required in the technology side. We need to adopt modern technology in agriculture, very important. And another thing is the government does not supply. I mean, we've always seen it in the news, and when we talk to the farmers also, there's always delay in supply of fertilizer. So timely and adequate supply of fertilizer is very important, and another important factor is seed, quality seed. So supply of quality seed is also equally important. And once the harvest season comes, where is the I mean, there aren't many appropriate or sufficient warehousing facilities. So that is also something that is required. And I see quite a few private corporate houses showing interest in investment in warehouse facility. So I think that is also going to help agriculture sector boost in the days to come. Now, coming back to branding, packaging and marketing. This is also something that I think Nepalese businesses, they lack. I'll just take an example of cardamom. Paris just mentioned about Nepal Trade Integrated Strategy 2080, that is 2023, which does add quite a few number of agriculture product in there. So one is cardamom. If you look at cardamom export, it has improved over the last 1 year. The export volume of cardamom have increased by 70%, which is good news. But the thing is, look at India and Guatemala. I mean, they're exporting huge amount of cardamom to countries like UAE, Saudi Arabia. And I was just going through a report that in 2021, Saudi Arabia alone imported $220 million cardamom. UAE imported around $180 million cardamom. See the huge potential of cardamom export to countries like UAE and Saudi, like Middle East, where you get high value. So I think the businesses should focus on packaging, proper processing, branding, marketing, and finding the right market to get good value for the product. So that is one area where we need to, I think, focus. That is for the private sector. And what was the other question? I kind of missed.
That's it.
Is that it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So Dorothy, you mentioned earlier about the STC's engagement in this technical and vocational education. And as I understand, this STC has a long-standing experience in this area. So I find a kind of paradox in Nepal here. You have a lot of training programs, you train these youths, and they go abroad, and they send remittances. And so do you think that this kind of training programs are very useful in terms of domestic production or, boosting Nepal's economy? Otherwise, it's a kind of a de-scaling process going on. You train, and people go abroad, and then they send remittances. And though at the micro level, remittances have been useful to reduce poverty and improve the education level of their children. But at the macro level, there is a kind of a policy complacency or real exchange, a kind of appreciation, and other macroeconomic problems. So what is your take on this usefulness of your programs?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you highlight the negative effects of migration, and this is also highlighted in the Nepal development update, and we shouldn't ignore them. I think that you're right. In the same time, I think migration has also its positive effects, and it's just a reality. I think we cannot say if it's bad or good or whatever. I mentioned before the big number of youth that is not in employment or education, and these youth, I mean, they should not sit idle, and they don't want to sit idle. They want to, make use of livelihood opportunities and get income. And their choice and what they see as an opportunity to do so is to migrate. So that's a fact, and we have to deal with the fact, or Nepal has to deal with the fact with our support. I think this shows also the weak productivity or the unsatisfactory productivity, let's say, of Nepal to absorb this youth and make useful use of them. So seeing migration as a fact, I think it's important to train people who migrate so as they find better jobs and better work conditions abroad, which is in turn also then an advantage when they come back, right? Because people working abroad, they are exposed to new realities, to new ways of working and new technologies. And I have met one and more startup or small and medium enterprise who was established by a returnee migrant. And I think they have a different way of looking at the market. So let's also look at that in a positive way. We do that, for example, through our program, Reintegration of Returnee Migrant Workers, REMI program, where we support employment skills centers, which supports then returnees with counseling and advice, to referral also to jobs and to entrepreneurship. So this is one area where we think, okay, this is maybe a gap to be filled for the market to make best use of the returnees. And then, yes, for sure, I mean, we also believe that trained people find better jobs here because, as I mentioned before, I mean, there is a lack of skilled labor here in this country. And if we provide more skilled youth to the economy, then probably the skilled youth will also find better jobs and then contribute also to the whole productivity of the country. So it's a two ways to go, and I think that's also the reality here. And maybe just to explain a little bit more on the innovation of this country. I think that innovation is for every country really the key to keep on a sustainable economic development and not be happy with the competitive they have because the world is changing, the global work is changing. And therefore we are working a lot on providing finance for innovation, finance for invest in growth. We are doing that at different levels along the whole market system. We are working, for example, with the World Bank to enhance and support the government of Nepal to manage foreign direct investment in a good way that attracts foreign direct investment. We're working with the World Bank also on creating evidence on the provincial investment climate. That is very important for us then to support the provinces and the government in general to provide a good investment climate. And we are also working with development finance institutions to attract development finance into Nepal to set the foundation then to attract private investment that will then go into the support of or for financial access of small and medium enterprises for innovation and growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let me come on to another issue of this special report, and it regarded this real exchange rate as one of the key determinants of exports in Nepal. And it says that a 10% appreciation of the bilateral real exchange rate is associated with 3% decrease in Nepali export. We have seen that the peg has remained fixed for almost 3 decades, so it's quite credible in that sense. And it has also helped to anchor inflationary expectation in Nepal. And so even though the inflation between Nepal and India is diverging in recent years, it has, is in line more or less coming, moving together in more or less a similar fashion. So based upon that, finding, Paras, what do you think about whether this finding itself provides sufficient evidence or sufficient ground for devaluation of the Nepalese currency or some exchange rate reforms?
So I'll try to answer this question, but I might end up throwing more questions and also highlighting further issues and agenda for research. But I guess that's what this discussion is about. So the result is, intuitive. Relative price increases, then exports, output decreases, exports go down. And because the results are intuitive, they are there, presented in the report, and the results are statistically significant. And going by also the fact documented in the report that Nepal's exchange rate has been appreciating, coupled with low productivity of various sectors, it means Nepalese firms are caught in a double whammy on the one hand, productivity is lagging, or in the manufacturing or industrial sector, it is going down. And then there's the other shock in the form of, exchange rate appreciation. And the good thing about this analysis in this report is that it uses firm-level data, because it's not the first time that the relationship between exports and exchange rate has been documented in the context of Nepal. It's mostly using time series data, as far as I know, including by the central bank. Here, they have taken a stab at that question using firm-level data, which is good. And talking about firm-level analysis, they have access to customs-level data, which is a treasure trove. And I should say, unfortunately, only accessible to the World Bank, not for lesser mortals like me, although I have tried multiple times. So in future, we can collaborate, jointly access such data, and we can also contribute on our side. Because very few firm-level analysis has been done in the Nepalese context, and usually it's the World Bank. I don't grudge you that, but I think we should also get access to such data. Now, I think a concern on the Nepali side is how will devaluation impact our trade balance? That concern is articulated by policymakers, including central bankers, and including central banks' analysis in the past also. So here you look at the export side. Now one has to look at the import side also. Now if you have access to customs data, which you have used, then you would have access to importers also in the same data set. And how does imports respond to exchange rate could be another question that you address. In that case, you will have, in a way, elasticity of exports to exchange rate change, as well as elasticity on the import side. And combining the two, you might be able to, which is just loud thinking, able to test the so-called Marshall-Lerner condition, for example. Are some of the two elasticities significantly higher than one or not, right? If they are higher than one, then, well, exchange rate, devaluation or depreciation might, improve the trade balance, could be one result. But then one must also take into account the fact that the Marshall-Lerner condition rests on the assumption that we have trade balance, to begin with. However, we have a huge trade balance. So elasticity of import and export with respect to, exchange rate being greater than one may not be enough. It may be required to be sufficiently greater than one. But how sufficiently greater than one? I'm not in a position to tell. So I think that's the concern of, policymakers also. But on this one, for example, I haven't come across IMF reports, for example, that explicitly, advocates devaluation, for example, because we know that IMF is not, shy about making recommendations to the government or the central bank, particularly with regard recently to the imposition of export restrictions or the cash margin requirements, or how credit is, tightened or relaxed. Now, the argument in favor of, say, not imposing import restrictions is that you are interfering with the free forces of the market, right? And in the long run, allowing imports will deliver. By the same token, since this exchange rate was, as you said, determined about 3 decades ago, right? Is this the right exchange rate or not is naturally a question, right? And then, okay, there is concern that once you devaluate, inflation will rise. Okay, point has also been highlighted, to be fair, in the report. But then inflation will rise, yes, but inflation will really rise, then imports may come down, and then exports may increase. Free market flows is at play. Similar, analogous to the argument or recommendation that comes out in many reports of multilateral development banks that we should liberalize tariffs, because there might be short-term pain, but eventually everything will fall into place. Resources will move from low productivity sector to high productivity sector, and bingo, voila, everything will be fine. So if you apply that argument to this case, since apparently real exchange rate is appreciating, and it was set 3 decades ago, bringing it to a so-called maybe optimal level, theoretically could, correct, right? And if you have concerns over this, then one must also have concerns about other types of recommendations, like with regard to reducing tariffs or reducing the effective rate of protection. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Paras, again. So let me come back again to the issue of these sluggish exports, and especially after the aftermath of this COVID pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine conflicts, we have seen, the contraction of exports. In fact, it contracted more than 20% last year. So my question to Arti is, so what are the measures taken by the banks to provide respite to the borrowers of the impacted sectors? That's one question. And our follow-up questions is that we have seen in some of the countries, they have set up this, what they call export-import banks to help, facilitate international trade and promote also the international trade. So what is your opinion regarding setting up such banks in Nepal? Thank you.
I just want to mention that NPA during the pre-COVID level, that is 2019, was 1.52. This, I'm talking about the banking industry here, which has over the last 4 increased to 3.02. So the uptick on NPA is a clear indicator that asset quality over the period of time has deteriorated. Definitely COVID impact, followed by increased inflation due to war in Russia and Ukraine, increased cost of production, reduced demand, moreover, ban on import to improve the foreign exchange reserve, and subsequent stress on government revenue collection, delay in